everyone. Welcome to the Poetry Vlog. Today we have Vico Naylor with us. Vico is a poet who was in one of my classes last quarter. Also good friends with Ananya, who you might remember from a prior episode. So this is the second one where we workshop a poem and talk about it in process. Vico, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and where people can find you?
So hi, I'm Vico. I'm a graduating senior at UW in creative writing. I'm trans and I've been published in the 2017 and the 2018 editions of Bricolage, the UW Literary Magazine. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Vico_exists.
Perfect. And then if you're listening to the podcast version, you'll find that in the description. And if you're watching the YouTube version, I'll have it pop up sometimes at the bottom so you can kind of go down there and click into it. So if you're like, I did not catch that, now you have it. I'm going to fix our camera angle and then we'll keep going. We're going to keep going. Okay. So camera angle fixed. So today what we're going to do is start with Vico's own poetry to make sure that we get to it. They brought two poems for us. So we'll look at one, which is like kind of a two-part one poem situation. And we'll talk a bit about line breaks and punctuation, right? And a little bit about embodiment in poetry and how you can create that with images. And then the second poem we look at, we're going to talk about joy in poetry. And oftentimes, people in general don't think of joyful poems as like a thing. When E.J. Koh was on, she actually talked about like writing her first happy poem for her partner, and it was like kind of a weird experience. But I think that it's an important one. So we're gonna talk about why it's especially important for trans poets. So that's kind of the lesson plan for today. We're gonna try and do it all in 20 minutes. So we're gonna get started right away. Vico, will you read the first poem for us?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Once I tried to kill a man by breaking a stick against a tree. But most men can't be killed, only ignored, and the stick only snapped a little, and I felt my anger curl up inside me and cool into cement in my stomach. So when the man told me to forgive him, I did. Alone in bed, I held myself like a collection of mountains, jagged and too large to contain. In the morning, he would wipe off my makeup and pull out pieces of my hair, said this was the only way he liked me. He folded my body into smaller and smaller pieces until my friends wouldn't see me, until I was the height of his hand, until he could touch me all at once. And once, when I got out of the shower, I saw in the mirror I'd become a small swarm of flies. When I wanted to leave him, I told him that the flies were all I'd ever been, that I didn't deserve him, but for the first time he softened and held me and called me the prettiest names, called me beautiful, said he was lucky to even be with me. And I cried because he'd never said that before, or because he still wasn't listening. And when he asked me why I thought I didn't deserve him, I told him I didn't love him. And when he tried to kill me, I became the air.
All right, thanks, Vico. If you're watching, comment below real quick and be like, hey, thanks for reading your poem, because that's really brave to do on YouTube. And I want to make sure that, y'all beat the trolls and share your affirmation and love. So first, let's talk about the punctuation in the prose block. Why don't you first talk about, this is the opposite of how we run workshops, but whatever. Why don't you talk about why you chose a prose block first and why it's important for you that the second part of the poem shifts into line breaks?
So I started out the poem with a prose block because I felt like it had the needed speed that I wanted. And I think we were talking a little bit earlier about how it kind of curls into itself. And I really like the momentum. And like you can kind of see the spiral. And then when I shifted into lineation, that was very intentional and important for me to really slow down the poem and blow up this one moment. And I feel like it just like hits harder emotionally that way.
What do you mean by hits harder emotionally?
I guess because it's slowed down rather than like speeding through this moment, you can really feel like, or at least I think that you can feel, or like I guess I wanted to communicate that emotion of when like an abuser for like the first time like switches it up on you like it's this like one moment of kindness kind of.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah. I think part of what's powerful to me about when you're slowing it down through the line break in particular is it creates a pacing that sort of breaks up what's otherwise a more expository, meaning like explanatory or essay style in the poem.
Yeah.
And it also sort of disrupts the assumed narrative of being caught in a cycle. It's still caught in a cycle. It's just making it more complicated, which is what it is.
Yeah.
I wanted us to focus on the prose block today because I'm especially excited by how Vico's using punctuation in this. So we're going to take a closer look here real quick. I'll have it come up on the screen if you're watching the YouTube version. So another plug for the podcast listeners. What I noticed when I was first reading it is that there's like a series of run-ons, right? Like can't be killed, only ignored, and it snapped, and I fell, and cool, right? So like you were saying, you sort of end up curling up with the poet into this sort of spiraling until it ends at I did, right? So there's just an assertion of like self. And then there's another run-on. And the run-ons are actually like very varied in length. So one mistake poets oftentimes make, I think, in prose form when it's not thought through is every sentence is structured the same. So you actually break up the pacing. Like the first one is like a line and a half long and the second one is like half a line long, right? And then the next one is like a line and a half. So there's like a sort of like push and pull happening. But what I noticed when I was first talking with Vico about this poem is when we get to the untils, and that's actually when the punctuation also stops, right? So he folded my body into smaller and smaller pieces but the until says that we are starting a kind of new sentence. So some thoughts that we had when we were talking about it earlier is how can that sort of build happen without needing some of the more traditional punctuation techniques in the other prose sections? So like maybe, for instance, if the like first line or two, you could replace periods with 4 or 5 spaces.
Yeah.
Right. And then the spaces get smaller until you get to the untils, or there's other ways to play with space and pacing.
Yeah.
Because something I really love about this poem is how much you get into the like physical experience, right?
Yeah.
People forget that an image isn't necessarily an embodiment, which is something else we were talking about. And I was like, you kind of get away with saying things like only ignored, which is actually very abstract because there's these like extremely specific images of the body, right? Like cement in my stomach, like cool into cement in my stomach, right? Or a collection of mountains, which is very different from saying I'm a mountain.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And then wipe off my makeup and pull out pieces of my hair are like two very different types of like interaction, if that makes sense. And the hair is hyper specific as well. So I personally found myself really pulled into the spiraling into the self through that body. And that was part of how like I could juggle what would otherwise maybe be like a larger abstraction, like what it means to be ignored.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of like juxtaposing the mundane with the other pieces. So in terms of the line break piece, I like that as well, obviously. And what we were talking about earlier is I loved how it ends on, and when he tried to kill me, I became air, or I became the air, sorry. We talk a little bit about how it feels for you when you wrap up the poem there.
So I don't really like it. It's frustrating to me that it ends on like that kind of like disappearing, and I hate that that's the end of this narrative as it is right now, and like I wish that it ended on like more of a triumph, even though like that's not the story and that's not the truth.
Yeah. It's interesting too because I find the idea of becoming air is very triumphant. Oh. Like, yes, I finally escaped my body. So it could be that as well. But I also read it as like a beginning. Like it actually feels very much like a launching off into something else. So it's interesting to me that you feel like it's also like a disservice to the speaker, right? That you're ending on this idea of air.
Yeah.
So something else they're talking about, and what I would love to see is if you created a longer project.
Yeah.
And you could even start like the different sections on different pages, and then you could continue this story of what happens when becoming air. Talk a little bit about the way that you have the line breaks going in and out, actually, because I think it's a really like underestimated technique for pulling off things like called me beautiful, which would normally again be this kind of like passing statement.
Yeah.
But I think you get away with it here. I keep saying get away with it like there's rules.
I'm tricking you.
Pull it off. I think
Yeah.
you pull it off here. So yeah, talk a little bit about the pacing of that, like expansion, compression.
Yeah, so I guess that I broke off lines where I wanted to have breath and when I wanted breath to interrupt.
Yeah.
So especially like called me beautiful. That was like very important for me to like isolate that.
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful comment, actually, because I think sometimes people think of print poetry and performance poetry as dichotomous. But what you're pointing to is ways that alineation is a form of creating a performance that your reader also goes through with you.
Definitely.
Exactly. It gives you room for breath.
Yeah.
What else about this poem do you want to talk about before we move on to the next one?
I guess something that I've been thinking about is how do you write trans bodies and how do like I express my body in poems. And a part of this poem is like the speaker's body going through these transformations, like starting as like it starts with such a powerful moment.
Yeah.
Almost like where the speaker has like so much agency and then like is shrunken. And I'm been thinking a lot about like how the body is represented in like, especially like with animals and like how it turns into, or like the body in the end of the prose block has become flies. And then like it gets even like more dispersed when the body becomes air. And I don't know if I have many more thoughts on that right now, but that's something that I've been thinking about.
I was going to say one of my other favorite images is the body becoming flies. And it starts kind of in the head, right? And then it like disperses.
Yeah.
So either will you talk a little bit more about those images, right? Because it sounds like you're moving into them, but you're unhappy with them, and there's different things you're trying to explore in them. And then I think that our viewers and listeners need to hear more about the importance of embodiment for trans poetics. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I guess bodies are very central to being trans, and like it's very much not true that like someone has to experience dysphoria, but like people like do associate dysphoria with being trans and like body transitions with being trans, and of course that's not necessary to identifying as trans, but like that's something that like I experienced personally. And so thinking about, well, like if I'm going to put a body in my poems, how do like what does it mean that I'm trans, and like how does that get reflected into my poems? And that's something that I'm like just beginning to think about. So
yeah, I think you're doing it really well too, so I'm excited about it. So that we don't not get to it, I want to get to your next poem.
Okay.
Let's preface it this time instead of reading it first and then talking about it, which is bad practice, I'm very aware, but we're going to do it anyway because I think it dovetails with what we were just saying. So you tried to write a joyful poem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why?
So I just feel like so much of trans poetry that I've found is about like dispossession of the body or like depersonalization of the body, and like with the last poem I just read is about a body disappearing basically. And I wanted to write a poem that's more embodied literally, and is more about like what does it mean to feel pleasure in the body, and like what does it mean for me to feel pleasure in the body, in my body.
And to not just associate like marginalized gender or sexuality with pain and rupture is really important, right? Because sometimes like, while we need to make clear the like plight and like the suffering, it can sometimes end up being so focused on that there's an assumption of like constantly being like unable to be happy or joyful, or like there isn't something joyful you're working toward that can really be experienced. Which, to be cheesy for me, is like the hopeful piece of that as well, right? It's like, it's not just like all pain and suffering because society is just like the worst, right? There's like very, very specific experiences of joy that happen, and that's what you're hopeful about. Like you would hope for a change in how we think about embodiment so that we can create that joyful experience for more folks. Right? So I was really excited that you wrote a joyful poem. I actually read it first as a love poem too, which I think it is in the best way. So, okay, I'm going to stop talking about it. Let's go ahead and pull it up. Okay. All right.
Hand play. crack an egg on your head, I touch you, the back of your neck, a tenderness that when you're grown, you'll ask your lovers to replicate. Feel the yolk running down. I glide over your neck hairs. Feel me, caress every bone of your spine, your whole body on my fingertips. Stab a knife in your back. My goal here is not to hurt you. You'll only feel a thump. Feel the blood gushing down. You gush electric. We are closer than skin. Pressed on skin allows. I place you on a cliff. I shake you. What color do you see when you fall off? I see pink clouds. I see your grip on my shoulders. You are the only thing holding me to this earth.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was my favorite of the poems that Vico sent me, actually. I want to make a couple quick references for viewers and listeners. One, I've already mentioned to you. So Paige Lewis is a writer who's also publishing poetry on like trans and non-binary identities.
Yeah.
Colleen Berner, actually, who will be on the vlog as well, does hybrid fiction poetry from like non-binary writing. Actually reminds me a lot of yours. You think you'd really like their work. And then Karen Barad. So that'll pop up in the screen right here as well. I guess I should go that way. I'm still learning this. So Karen Barad has an essay called Transmaterialities. I forgot to mention to it earlier. If you're listening to the podcast, you'll find either on the YouTube or in the description how it's spelled and a link to it. You can get the essay for free through the UW library. And if you email me, listeners or viewers, I'll get you a copy, because knowledge should be free. Yeah. And Karen Barad is a hybrid molecular biologist and trans theorist scholar, like PhD in both.
Whoa.
Super brilliant, and wrote an essay called Transmaterialities about, and it's a mixture of joy poems and like the joy experienced in like the electric field of becoming. So you would like that. Science people that like poetry, you would really like it. And I can't not mention that because it's one of my most transformative essays I've ever read of poetry in yeah. Anyway, let's get back to your poetry and why that made me think of it. So some things I want to note that I'm really excited by in this poem. I am biased towards this because I love spaces in lines, granted, but I hate spaces in lines when they're not very clearly doing something, when they're like a gimmick. And what I liked about this is they're not a gimmick, right? And I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking about these poems that it really functioned to highlight the sort of physical experience of these things, like the sensation on the skin and on the body. So while the previous poem was very much in the body, this one feels a lot more for the first couple of lines like we're getting in, but we're starting on the surface. Crack an egg on your head obviously sounds lovely because of the egg head, right? And then the kraken and on your has a very set rhythm and rhyme to it. And it's also a very specific sensation. Right? And it's not usually where you necessarily think a joy poem would start. And that's part of how you can then say something like, I touch you, which again would be like a very simple statement, but the crack an egg on your head and then the feeling of it going down the back of the neck is so particular that you can make those bigger statements. Same with why you can say a tenderness. And then I also see these kind of spaces as creating the breath in between without necessarily resetting to the next line in a kind of obvious way. But it also creates a sort of physical space between like touching and feeling in like a good way. It's like playing around in that space. I feel like I'm basically like summarizing Barad's essay now, actually. So again, check out that essay. It's amazing. And actually comment below with your favorite part of this poem. Because I don't know, I didn't ask that earlier. So why it also works for me though is that the stab a knife in your back, my goal here is not to hurt you, you'll only feel a thump, is like a slight tonal change. We officially like go into the body in a violent way as opposed to these very like specific like gliding over neck hairs, gooiness, right? There's no breaths in the middle, but weirdly it's more truncated precisely because you make us go back to the beginning of the line. And it functions as a volta. Volta, by the way, just means like the change in the middle of the poem to the next part. And then you kind of go back into that other voice where those spaces again kind of function to compress and move out. So something I commented on when I first read the poem is in my MFA group, I can guarantee that they would have been like, oh no, the poem ends at what color do you see when you fall off? But I'm not convinced it does. Talk a little bit about why you also don't think it ends there.
I think it's important to not end on the image of a body falling off a cliff. That's not very joyful. And I think bringing it back to like seeing like pink clouds and like bringing it back to the like to the intimate moment of like two people holding each other or like one person like holding on to someone was very important for me. And I should have mentioned this earlier when we were talking, but this is actually like a blown up like childhood game. So it's like crack an egg on your head, feel the yolk running down. And so like I like it's like very much like childish and like but also like real. I don't know.
Another reading resource, actually, I've mentioned to you a lot before, is I think you'd really like The Book of Frank by C.A. Conrad, so I'll have that pop up as well. So I agree. I was basically like, I feel like there is something about now seeing what is seen. And it's a very similar move to the becoming heir of the poem before.
Yeah.
Right? It's like this launching off.
Yeah.
So the other part we ended up really focusing on was, you are the only thing holding me to this earth.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't buy it. Like, it's hyperbolic, right? Like, it's so rare that there are things that are always and onlys.
Yeah.
But then you said that what you're struggling with is that it's a thing.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I just feel, I guess, uneasy about having what would be the you in the last, in the italics, described as a thing and not more of a person. And I know that you like things and think that they're like cool, but sorry, that came out totally wrong. But I know that you.
I got you. It's cool.
I know. But for me, like I wanted the you to have a body and to be more than just like, oh, I'm a thing touching you, or like I'm a thing giving you these feelings. But I wanted the you to like not be, I guess, separated from personhood, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So this is where we would end up debating, but it's Vico's poem, so Vico would end up doing what felt right, right? Because I was like, personhood's a problem, and thing is so much more open and like not trapped in like human or animal or person or non-person. But the point is that for you, the speaker is stuck as a thing because you haven't sorted out what it is. Yeah. Right? Like, person doesn't quite work because you're also very critical of those types of categories. Like, I know because Vico's my student. And I thought that this was similar to the poem before and opening outward then for you to keep exploring the thing. Yeah. So what I settled on as my personal take is I would love to see both of these poems in a longer project. Yeah. Especially maybe chapbook form and just using page breaks to enter the different voices. So that way you could kind of get the best of both worlds. Okay. Right? Like you could have your reader for a minute actually think about a question, like what color do you see when you fall off? That's not a small question. That's actually a really like interesting, like slight tweak on like an otherwise common image of falling off a cliff. Yeah. But you're then not being like, and that's where we end. You know? Right. You actually then explore what you see in this kind of like beautiful mix of pink clouds and gripping shoulders, which are almost opposite tensions. Yeah. And I think I have a lot to say on like what you could see when you're falling off. And I really like the idea of like ending the page there, but then having there be a whole nother poem, diving into like who is the speaker, what is the thing, and like what are you seeing, and like I guess, I don't know, how does it feel to like have someone holding you to this earth? Yeah. But like not being the only thing, not using that language. And my hunch too, which I can be wrong on because it's your poem, is that you're struggling to find one word for thing because it's not one thing. Yeah. Right? This is a thing that's very thing. I love thingness. I'm so sorry, everyone. But this is a concept that's deeply integrated in queer and trans communities, is that we can't be consolidated into singular. Yeah. Right? Like my poor students, I totally went off because one of them made a comment about like how they, them is plural. And I'm like, well, we're all plural anyway. Like, we're going to go there. Like, it could be singular or it could be plural, and it doesn't matter. Like, I challenge you to, like, say I am and fill in the blank with one single thing and not have it be, like, complicated by other things. It's a myth that we're singular beings with, like, sole, individual, closed-off identities. And for me, one of the most, like, mind-explosive things that happened for me in undergrad was this ability to say, like, oh, it's okay to, like, explore and become various things. I don't have to be on a linear trajectory. I don't have to settle into one. I don't have to say I am this or I am that. And for me, even they then became too limiting because it was like, no, it's still one thing. You know?
Yeah. I think I have a lot to say about this.
Do it.
And so I think I've recently been like steering away from the language of like non-binary because that's still connected to a binary, and using more describing myself as trans or gender queer. And also like thinking about like plurality is like such like a trans experience, like just like naming like, oh yeah, my gender is like a potato, or like I don't know, like you see like all this on like Twitter of like oh like the two genders, like that joke which only trans people should make, and like all of that, like just like what does it mean to be trans? And like it comes down to the fact that like trans is not this separate category, and like what the real categorization is like the Western binary of like male and female, and like trans is like not its own category. Like people say, I'm going off here.
No, that's good. I completely agree.
Like people say like, well, like trans people have been around forever, and like that's not really like how it has worked. Like it's more like people have been around forever, but what is new is the binary that's separating people and like making people feel otherized, capital O, others.
Yep. No, I completely agree. I'm glad you went on that tangent. I remember seeing a tweet with one person that was like, why do I have to settle into saying if I'm like a gay, straight, bi, trans, like instead of being like, what if I just identify as influx?
Yeah.
To socially plug myself, which I rarely do, but I did do an episode about like my rage at having my sexuality always confined to these like categories, and I was like, bisexual is a really violent category because it's always assuming that it's binary because you're presenting in your gender as binary, and like what it really does is it reveals like the discontinuity between our presentation and our sexuality, and then also the fact that like neither ever fit in the first place. Like there is no such thing, and that it's always, and it's okay for it to constantly be in flux and shifting and moving, and another element of just like being. And I think to me what's exciting about like the coalitional opportunities with trans poetics and queer poetics and feminist poetics is that like the kind of centering of these voices that's finally happening is also finally saying like, dude, the binary doesn't really like exist in a real way any more than like transness exists in a real way. Like, they're all just ways that we're making different choices based on our conditions. You know, and becoming and moving within it. And we're gonna start doing our wrap up.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for being on the Poetry Vlog.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it was a real pleasure. As you can see, I get the coolest students. Not cool as in like cool kids, but like cool as in like, you know, you're also a cool kid. I give up. We'll take both. But point is, I have the best students oftentimes, and even though I get tired of teaching, it's what makes teaching awesome because I get to learn so much in the process. So thank you. It was a real pleasure. And it took an extraordinary amount of vulnerability. So again, if you're watching this, let Vico know how awesome they are. Like, I could be more specific. Like, name your favorite lines in the poem. Name, here's a great comment to leave. If you have a trans poet that you're like thinking is doing the thing right now, to play on thing, leave that in the comments. If you're like, I'm listening to the podcast and now you're rambling, that's cool. Go over to iTunes and leave us a rating, right? Because it helps to have non-trolls watch these things and leave their comments in the ratings. People underestimate that. Teacher Evaluations 101. So on that note, before I start rambling too much, remember to follow the Poetry Vlog on Twitter. I've migrated the Poetry Vlog's Instagram for now to my personal one, so Chelsea_Grimmer. It might change again, but for now it's that. So you can kind of keep everything there. And then on Facebook, I post daily updates, and I have a newsletter coming out. So whether you're listening to the podcast or you're following the YouTube episode, the newsletter is gonna give you basic content updates, like what we have coming up and what's happened, but it's actually gonna focus on what's happening for people that have been on the vlog. So like if someone who's been on the vlog is like, hey, I got this poem published, I'll be like, cool, put it in the newsletter. So people who loved their episode can follow. If it goes like, hey, I got into grad school, I'll be like, cool, put it in the newsletter. So it's kind of a way of building community. You can sign up for it over at thepoetryvlog.com, and it will start in March. I think that's everything. Remember to subscribe. All right. Thank you again.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.